Good morning, everybody, and welcome into the Meadows Museum and to our second in our six-part lecture series on the art of medieval and Renaissance Spain. So please let me remind everybody to turn your cell phones to silent or off at this time. Mine's still off from last night's lecture, which means I miss all my phone calls. So our speaker today is Alibhai. I don't know why I don't want to say that. Sorry. Alibhai, visiting lecturer at the University of Texas, Dallas. Professor Alibhai is a PhD graduate from the Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations Department at Harvard University. He is a scholar of the histories and cultures of Muslim societies and focuses his research on the medieval Maghreb and Mediterranean worlds, with specializations in the histories of and art and architecture of medieval Tunisia, Sicily, Spain, and Morocco. His academic work combines the study of textual and historical studies with art and architectural history to further understand the socio-cultural history and material culture of the medieval Islamic world. Before joining Harvard, Professor Alibhai completed a master's in medieval studies here at Southern Methodist University, and I should add at this time that he is a Dallas native, and we're so pleased to have, we were just talking, so many scholars locally that are focused on Spain. It makes my job a lot easier around here. He is back home for the year, and he is currently joined the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at UTD in his role as visiting lecturer. We're so fortunate that he's here and that he was agreeable to come and speak to us as part of this series with his lecture today, From Sound to Sight, Understanding the Medieval Western Muslim Practice of Converting Christian Bells into Lamps. So please join me in welcoming Professor Alibhai.
Just going to make sure, can you hear me correctly? All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming out here today. It's compared to what I'm used to for the last 8 years in New England, I would say this is a beautiful spring day, but maybe not to Texas standards. And I would like to thank Scott and Wendy and Amanda for arranging this talk today at the Meadows. It's actually quite nostalgic and very special to me to give this talk today here because this project actually began when I was doing my master's here at SMU. And my project at that time was basically something that I termed From Sound to Light, and I gave my first presentation about this project in this very room right here for a class that I was taking at the Meadows School of Art at the time in medieval history and the idea of convivencia. Convivencia basically was a concept that was very popular at that time that suggested that medieval Spain had created a culture where Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived together in harmony, and what some scholars have suggested as Cordoba during this time period was an ornament of the world because of the way these cultures interacted with each other. Today, the concept of convivencia, scholars are looking at it to understand, to see, is it still useful to sort of view a culture or a cluster of cultures as interacting with one another when there were also times of war along with times of peace. The project today, I would like to suggest is, yes, it still can be considered an extension of convivencia, because these cultures, whether they were at peace or they were at war with each other, they still understood each other great enough to assimilate each other's visual and cultural identities in their own art, thus forming new art with new meaning. And so I will begin. And the lecture is going to be focused on a group of bell lamps in present-day Morocco, but I will start the talk actually with not too close, not too far off from Dallas. Actually, we're going to start with the southwestern United States. So I haven't gone yet because I'm waiting for the weather to get warm enough to visit Santa Fe, New Mexico. But in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Santa Fe boasts that they have the oldest church in the United States. And it's the San Miguel Mission. And the sign outside the mission boasts that it's the oldest church structure in the USA. The original adobe walls and altar were built by the Tlaxcalan Indians from Mexico under the direction of Franciscan Padres in circa 1610. So what is really interesting about this church is that it has a historical bell, and like most historical objects, local popular legend arises around its origins. So a Catholic priest and writer named Joseph McBooth, he died in 1889, but he wrote a lot about these early churches and the early history of Catholicism in the United States. And in his biography the author's name was W.J. Howlett, but he wrote a biography of the first Catholic bishop of Denver, Joseph McBooth. And in that he writes, in 1356, so the legend runs, the Spaniards were fighting the Moors. Battle after battle was fought and lost by the Christians until the people vowed a bell to St. Joseph as a gauge of their gold and silver plate. As a gauge of their faith, they brought their gold and their silver plate, their rings and their bracelets, their brooches and their earrings, and cast them into a melting pot with other metal. And then the bell was cast, and in its tone was the richness of gold and the sweetness of sacrifice. It sounded the defeat of Muslimism in Spain, and then came to ring in the birth of Christianity in Mexico, and with the Padres, it found its way up the Rio Grande to the west and ring out its sweet notes over the city of Holy Faith. So, for the longest time in Santa Fe, the bell on the left, which is still housed in the San Miguel Church, was believed to have dated to 1356, brought over from Spain, and basically hung in Santa Fe to ring out over the city. That would have been really great for my research. Unfortunately, the 1356 was actually 1856. The strike of the 8 was just a little bit off. So, but what it does tell us is that this legend and this idea that bells held this idea of freedom and of ringing out a sound that evoked a meaning actually carried itself over from medieval Spain to Mexico and is part of our American history today. And so my research for the last several years has been trying to understand sacred sound in urban spaces and religious spaces, and to try to understand how people interact with these sounds and how they react to them, and how when these sounds are disparate from the culture that it belongs to, how do opposing cultures or disparate cultures, because opposing isn't the best word, but different cultures basically react to each other's sound. And I try to look at this through history first. And so today's talk, basically, I would like to say that in the Muslim tradition, the medieval Islamic tradition, bells were often not welcomed in medieval Islamic civilization to be rung publicly in the cityscape. And I want to say that there was three main reasons for this. Generally, the bell itself as an instrument was considered unfavorable in religious thought. Second, medieval Muslims basically, when they had their own public call to prayer, and because the bell was already, or the Christian call to prayer was already an established practice, when they started conquering other cities, they found this practice in conflict with their own practice, and so it became important for one dominant culture to silence the sound of the other culture. And generally, because this idea is linked to conquest of cities, this idea of silencing public sacred sound became a very important trope in the Middle Ages. So specifically today, we're going to be talking about the project that I started here long ago at SMU. And that would be the artifact on the left. The artifact on the left is actually a bell lamp. It hangs in originally a 9th century mosque in Morocco, but the lamp was forged in the 12th and 13th centuries, and in the middle, you can see that there is a bell. And it would be smart for me to point out that as far advanced as medieval civilizations were, they had not invented electricity. But you can see that the modern practices, that they've kept these ancient mosques in the ancient lamps in the mosque still, and they found some way to rewire them so that electricity could flow into them. But in the original lamps, this would have had a glass shade, and there would have been an oil lamp inside. And then you can imagine the multitude of that many of how much light it would create in the mosque. The artifact on the right, that is me in my youthful days before I started my PhD. So when I finished my degree at SMU, through SMU actually I was awarded a Fulbright to go study this phenomena in Morocco. And so because of the education I received here, the Fulbright is a grant from the US State Department, and so I went away to Morocco with my wife and 6-month-old baby, and we basically went to go discover this project. And I do thank my wife for that support, because not everybody wants to go to a foreign country for 9 months to look at lamps. So. But before we go to Spain, I do want to take you on a little journey of this idea across Muslim civilization in the pre-modern period. And by pre-modern period, I mean before the modern era. So basically, from the before the 1800s, of how this idea of sacred sound developed in Islamic culture and how it developed in dialogue with all the other religions that it encountered and with their sacred sound. So, as we know, a brief history of the religion of Islam, it began in Arabia around the year 600. It was spread by a man named Muhammad. Muhammad was the prophet, and he created his own community of believers. He first started in a city, trade city in the Arabian Peninsula called Mecca, and a few years later, he basically emigrated to another city called Medina, where he basically spread most of his religion. So when Islam was spread from Medina, when the Muslims first arrived in Medina, they create a mosque and the Prophet's house next to the mosque. And the actual community grows from that point onwards. So as the community grew, and prayer became a ritual that was a communal ritual. So there was a local mosque in Medina, the Prophet's mosque, and everybody going to this mosque. They needed a way to basically call people to prayer. And so when we look at early Hadees literature, and by Hadees literature, I mean the literature that, so we have the Quran on one side, which is the Muslim's holy book, but a lot of the details of what to do in the Quran, so the Quran will tell you to pray, but all the ideas of how to pray and what are the rituals involved in it, we learn that from basically the sayings of the Prophet or the traditions of the Prophet, and that's called the Hadith. So in the Hadith, we learn that when the Prophet first said, hey, let's think of our own idea of how to call people to prayer, it was suggested to him to, it was suggested to him to basically emulate the shofar of the Jews, which is a horn used to emit a sound that would call people and they would know to gather. The second idea, actually, because in the Near East at that time they didn't have bells, the bell actually, ritual of calling, like ringing metal, actual physical bell, was actually a North African practice begun in the 6th century, picked up by the Christian liturgy in the 6th century in North Africa. In the Near East, they used a device called the semantron, in plural semantra. And what it is, and it's still used in the Greek Orthodox Church today. So it is a long wooden board, and you hit it with the mallet, and it produces a sound very similar to the sound emitted by a bell. And here is a picture of St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai in Egypt, where you can see they still employ the semantra and the bell in the tower. So when the Prophet Muhammad was sort of introduced to these two concepts, he decided that, the community decided together that we'll just do our own device. And what they decided was that they would do an oral call to prayer called the adhan. And the adhan basically is a set formula of phrases religious phrases put together that basically a physical person would climb on a corner of the mosque or the roof and deliver it to call the faithful to prayer. And we can see that that ritual in the beginning was basically a ritual that was incorporated by their interaction with other faiths. However, symbols and meanings change. And through the environment that is around us, religious ideologies also sometimes change and adapt to the political situation around them. And so here, soon after the death of the Prophet, so the Prophet died in 632, between 632 and 656, Islam began here in Mecca and Medina, and it began to spread towards the northeast and towards the northwest, and then down into North Africa, in Cairo, and spread across the peninsula of North Africa. And by 711, the Muslims had basically come to southern Spain, and by the end of 750, the Muslim Empire is expanding all the way from China to the east. I didn't bring that map, and all the way to the west to the borders of southern France. So you can imagine that this one little small society beginning in Arabia encountered so many disparate cultures as it spread across this great global period in such a short amount of time, so between 632 to 710. In that idea, I understand that this is when the idea of public Christian bell ringing or the ringing of the Sumantra came into a conflict with these armies that were expanding. And so what we have is one policy that was created by the second caliph of Islam. His name was Omar. And when Omar basically visited he basically conquered the city of Jerusalem. He conquers the city of Jerusalem in 637, and part of that historic understanding of that conquest is that there is a document that spreads itself throughout medieval history that is called the Pact of Omar. And the Pact of Omar is basically a treaty that Omar basically gave to the Christians living in Jerusalem. They were Byzantine Christians, so it was an exchange that he had with the Byzantine Patriarch of Jerusalem named Sophronius. And in that exchange, basically, he promised protection to the Christian populace of Jerusalem, but in exchange, he said that you will agree to my stipulations. The stipulations include several different things, but for today's purposes, the one that I want to focus on is that it regulated on visual symbols and also oral symbols, so A-U-R-A-L, sonic symbols. So what I have here is a 15th century map of Jerusalem done by Erhard Ruich, and it's basically the soundscape, the cityscape of Jerusalem. So you can see the temple or the Dome of the Rock in the middle. Here's the Temple Mount that he drew at that time, and then here in the back is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And what you can imagine at the time that he's drawing this map in the 15th century, but if you go back to the time of Omar in the 7th century, is that the idea is that along with the visual symbols in the streets, the audio symbols in the cityscape were meant to identify with the rulers, not with the ruled. And from this pact, we see a policy emerging in medieval Muslim civilization where rulers basically, anytime they are attacking a city that has a Christian majority, part of the stipulation, the peaceful stipulations, is that we will protect you, but you have to agree that our sound, our sacred sound, will be louder than your sacred sound. And so back to this exact map that I brought, this bird's eye view of Jerusalem, Ruich actually traveled with a Dominican friar in the 15th century to Jerusalem, and his name was Felix Fabry. And Felix Fabry basically, he has a travelogue that basically tells us all the events that he encountered on his travels. And Felix, when he basically, to get to Jerusalem, he was from Ulm in Germany, so basically he had to go down through the Mediterranean, and then he stopped at Cyprus. And when he was at Cyprus, basically, he says that he goes to the Stravrouni monastery in Cyprus, and in that he says, this is a monastery where there's a bell, and we know that St. Helena also placed a piece of the true cross here, and he basically says that this bell rung, and I did not hear a bell, and then from there he goes on to Muslim land. So at that time, Jerusalem was ruled by the Burji Sultan, the Burji Mamluk sultans who were from Egypt, and in the 15th century, and he basically says that for the space of 4 months after I left Cyprus, I did not hear a bell ringing once. And so he goes on to describe his visit to Jerusalem. And what he says in Jerusalem is that I did hear the mantra, but I did not hear the bell. He was like, the bell was completely forbidden. And what he says in his chronicle is, quote, this church, and he's talking about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, when he sees it, he says, this church has connected with it a lofty tower built of white marble stone, wherein once hung bells, and the beams and woodwork to support them may still be seen in the upper part where they used to hang. But when Jerusalem was lost, the bells were all cast down, for the heathens of the rite of Muhammad cannot endure bells, because they have a commandment in their Al-Quran, or the Quran, not to use bells for the service of God, nor to suffer them to be so used. Yet it is said that they like to hear their chimes, but the only reason that they don't let them be heard is that they fear that they should imitate us, meaning the Christians, against which the accursed Muhammad always took precautions. So Fabry's assertion, obviously, he was writing as a medievalist, as someone who actually lived in the Middle Ages. He had a long journey, so in travelogues we have to actually approach them with a little caution, because anybody who's traveled a specific airline, I won't give any names, but hey, Southwest is from Dallas and it's a great airline, but other airlines, if you've traveled Southwest and you travel another airline, let's say you're even going to Florida or something, and your trip was that bad that you're already grumpy the first 4 days of your trip. So we have to sort of take these travelogues with a grain of salt, but they also do reflect the ideologies that he's seeing at the street at that time. And what are those ideologies that we see is that the bell is, that the idea is that he's not hearing the bell at all, and he's understanding that there's some commandment of why he can't hear the bell. So he says that there's a policy that the Muslims aren't ringing the bells. And so I would like to talk about this policy of how it expressed itself in the visual culture of the pre-modern period. And the first example, and we're going to work back into time, so we're going to start with the closest examples and then work back to medieval Spain, which are the earliest examples. So here we have a bust in the Naval Museum in Constantinople, or sorry, Istanbul, of an admiral named Piale Pasha. And Piale Pasha basically was an admiral who was the main naval admiral for Suleiman the Magnificent, and he carried out a whole bunch of naval operations in the Mediterranean against Philip of Spain in 1598. And so during his raids that he did on Otranto or southern Italy, he basically captured a lot of bells and then brought them back to Istanbul, and he melted them down, and in the grills, the window grills, they're not extant today, but in the window grills of his mosque, this is a architectural rendering of his mosque, he basically melted them down and made beautiful grills as a symbol, as a trophy of these captured bells, and he brought them back to the capital. The Ottomans were neighbored by the Safavids, who were a Persian empire, and they ruled from the 17th to the 18th century. And they had a beautiful capital in Isfahan. This is actually their central square in Isfahan. So the mosque is on this side, and on the northern side this is their market. And the market is called the Al-Qaisariya. It was very popular for Europeans to travel there in the 17th century, 18th century in trade, and so there was a lot of activity between Isfahan and Western Europe. During that time, we actually have travelers from Western Europe going there and reporting back that above the portal of the Qaisariya, so this is the entrance of the Qaisariya market, they saw on the top there was a third story, which is not there today, which housed a bell. And that bell was actually taken from a nunnery in Hormuz when they were having naval raids near Portugal, and they brought it back, and the idea here was that the bell was hung there, but it never rung, it was silent. I recently have tried to understand this phenomena in India as well, because, as I said, by the end of the 8th century, the Muslims had spread all the way across from China to India to Spain. However, India always gives us a different picture. This is one of the earliest mosques complex in India. It's the Quwwat al-Islam Mosque in Delhi. It was built in the 12th century. The construction began in 1193, and the ruler who built it was Qutbuddin Aibak. And it said that he also took spolia, meaning the remains of existing buildings around him. So he went to 27 Jain Hindus and temples in the area and brought their pillars back to build his own mosque. So you can actually see in the mosque there are human shapes. These are all basically holding up the roof of the mosque. But in these pillars, I ended up seeing bells as well. So it doesn't seem like they were particularly controversial for in this context, which is something that I'll have to look in later. Even in the Chronicles, I'm not seeing that this same policy that we see in other parts of the world of silencing bells was actually administered in India. So this is a to be continued. But I thought that I would bring it just to show that it might not be a complete global policy. But for today's purposes, let's go back to Spain. So Spain, as I said, was conquered and ruled by medieval Muslims, expanding their territory in 711. And in the 10th century, they made their capital Cordoba, and an Umayyad dynasty ruled there for the next 200 years. One of the emirs from this dynasty, the caliph was young, 11 years old. His name was Al-Mazur in the Latin sources, Al-Mansur bin Abi Amir in the Arabic sources. And because he had the young caliph put aside, he needed something to create his own legitimacy of rule. And so what he does is that he basically starts raiding the remaining Christian territory in the north of Spain and Portugal. And what he does is he attacks the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, which its construction began in the 11th century, and the records, both Latin sources and Arabic sources, tell us that he brought the bells back from Santiago on the backs of Christian captives, and he hung them in the Great Mosque of Cordoba, which was built in the 8th century by the Hispano-Umayyads. And he hung them in the central aisle. So a central aisle, a medieval mosque, and we'll see a map that's coming up, but basically the aisle of the main prayer niche is called the mihrab, and this aisle is usually bigger than the other aisles of the mosque, and so many chronicles tell us that he hung them in this middle aisle as lamps. They're not extant today because in 1236, when Ferdinand III of Castile retook Cordoba from the Muslims, the first thing that he did was he went to the minaret, which is the tower attached to the mosque, from which the call to prayer is given by the Muslims. He converted that into a bell tower, and he put his standard on top of it, and then the third gesture that he did was that he made sure that the bells were sent back to Santiago. But what that period shows us is that there is a lot of conflict going on in this area. And as I said in the beginning, is that when there's these times of conflict, then these ideas change, and they, because of these ideas changing and because of conflict, new visual forms emerge. And from this emergence of new visual forms was this idea that we're going to emulate, and so this activity is mostly happening in the 13th century, where the Reconquista is happening. And so from it starts mainly in the 11th century at the fall of Toledo, and then we see it going all the way up to 1492 when Isabel and Ferdinand take Granada from the last Muslim kingdom of Spain, and basically all of Spain becomes Christian. But one of the cities that they take before they take Granada is Almeria in southern Spain, and from a text of a German physician and traveler who also made maps, another travelogue, he says that he visited this mosque that had already been converted into a church. So this is the great mosque of Almeria, which is today the Iglesia de San Juan. And from the, it's not as clear as you'd like to see, but some of the architectural revealments of the original building, you can actually see the original Muslim mosque behind the walls of the church. And here you can actually see the prayer niche. So from the ceiling of this mosque, he says that he saw a series of bells that had been captured by the Muslims and turned into lamps. And he basically reaffirms this with two other travelers that he meets on the way. But by the time he had visited the mosque, actually, it had been converted into a church, so the bells had been removed, but actually, the two other travelers confirmed to him that this was true, that when they had seen the mosque earlier, they saw that there were lamps hanging in the ceiling. So this tells us that when the mosque was reconverted into a church again, even here in Almeria in the 15th century, the bell lamps were removed. And again, we talked about Cordoba, the same thing happening. Now, lucky for us is that this practice is no longer extant in Spain, but in Morocco, we still have a series of bell lamps in situ in the Qarawin Mosque in Fez, which was the religious capital at that time, and in another city west of Fez called Taza. So in this mosque, like a typical medieval mosque is a T-style plan, and by T-style means that, like I said earlier, the central aisle is a lot bigger than the rest of the aisles of the mosque. So a mosque has several pillars and arches. This one has several arches continuing on throughout the mosque. But in this central aisle, so here's the entrance. You would enter into a courtyard, and then you would enter this central aisle, which is longer and more elevated than the rest of the aisles in the mosque. Because as you go further, you will go to the prayer niche in the front. So in that central aisle, these 13th century rulers of Morocco and southern Spain at the time, called the Almohads, decided that they would continue the practice of bringing bells back from Spain and converting them into lamps and putting them in the mosque. And the roof of that central aisle, you can tell the ceiling has been decorated in a lot of ornament of the time. So this is what we call a muqarnas design. It's sort of a stalactite type ceiling, which is a series of angles of different pieces of wood and stucco put together to create sort of a jigsaw puzzle ceiling. But the lamps are basically hung in the central aisle in domes like this. So there are 10 consecutive domes from the entrance to the mihrab, to the prayer niche, and in each of these hangs a significant lamp, of which 6 have medieval bells. And here's another view of the central aisle. So most art historians, we classify these lamps into 2 types. The first type I will just call type A. I can't think of anything fancier. But basically what they are is like, here's the bell, and you can tell that they have 3 concentric sort of rings surrounding the bell. And then you see the wicks. The wicks are sort of in either floral shapes or architecture shapes. And under each bell, there is a base plate. And under the base plate, there is another plate, and under that, knobs. And so the idea of these knobs are basically to higher and lower it. So when you lower it to the ground, it can actually stand on the ground as a stand, and then you can fill it with the oils and relight them again. So they come up and down. I don't know if they do that today with the electricity, but we know that in some of the exhibitions that have been happening, they have taken these to France to show in the exhibition and take them back to Morocco again. So. The second type, basically, so the first type was 3 circles, and the second type is actually wings, basically open arabesque work, wings of metalwork encircling the bells. And again, the wicks are on the edges of these triangular wings. Again, the bell is placed on a base plate, and the base plate here is a more elaborate one, often has brackets. This is open work, so basically you can imagine the light from here shining through here, and the pattern basically illuminating on the floor. And this is why I like to call this project From Sound to Light. And these are the bottoms of the base plate, and these are my pictures. So these are actually some of the same lamps, but these are pre-polish, and these are after polish. So this is when I went on my Fulbright. I basically snuck in my camera, because you don't see very many pictures of the inside of the mosque, but I snuck in my camera and basically laid down while nobody was looking and took these pictures from the bottom. But here's the base plate. Again, you can see that there's a lot of inscriptions around them, inscriptions around the roundels, and then it's split into brackets, and each of these brackets, this is another example, inscriptions around, and then very beautiful floral arabesque designs covering the entire bottom of these plates. As this project evolved further, what I noticed was that they were these were actually, these lamps, if you look closer, are actually resembling contemporary architecture. So it's actually a form of micro-architecture. And what you can see here is definitely this is what a mosque window would look like the grills that we talked about earlier. There's inscriptions here, there's inscriptions around the front, and then you can see that they purposefully made crenellations which look like the top of the buildings, very much like the Great Mosque of Cordoba. And here are the knobs. This is a very good close-up of the knobs. I think, no, because the oil basically would be filled into each separate lamp separately. Yes, it's completely hollow. And we'll answer that question in just a second, because I made an important discovery. But the third component of these lamps is that when I looked closer at the bottom, so we saw architectural features on the side, and at the bottom I first understood these as sort of like scalloped flower looking like ornamentation of this metalwork. But when you compare it to the contemporary architecture that these societies are building at the time in both Spain, so this is the Great Mosque of Cordoba, and this is a bath structure that was built in the 11th century in Marrakesh. You can tell that the patrons of these lamps were also emulating micro-dome architecture to create the beauty of these lamps. And this is actually I didn't bring a picture of the full lamp itself, but this, and my camera at that time, its lens, I think an iPhone is much more powerful now. It didn't get the full bottom of the lamp, but this is actually one of the oldest lamps in Morocco, and this was the under part of the lamp. And so what you can see here is, and this lamp did not have a bell. This lamp is actually quite enormous. It's a little bit wider in radius than this table, in diameter than this table, and but you can see exactly this is a ribbed open-work dome in the Great Mosque of Tilmasan in Algeria to the west that was built by the same dynasty that patroned these lamps. And so you can see that they are transferring direct works of architecture into these lamps. This is a third example that we can see. This one, the bell is no longer extant, but this is in a local museum in Fez, but we can say that this is part of that genre of bell lamps. And then as we move further east, there is a mosque called Taza. And Taza, basically, the story behind this is that I took my wife and my daughter at that time was like 9 months year old, and we were stationed in Fez. And it basically took us, it was like a 6-hour train ride from Fez to Taza. And I got there and I was just so excited to go and see this, and all of a sudden we weren't there at the right timings when the mosque opened, and so no one would open it for us to go see it inside. And so we spent the whole day there, didn't find anything, ate some local restaurant, somebody invited us into their house. Moroccans are very hospitable, and we basically came back. And then towards the end of my Fulbright, I was like, I cannot leave without seeing this, and so I went back again on another 6-hour train ride, and my wife said, I'm not coming with you, so. But what we can see here is that it's basically that first type A, 3 rings. There's open work here. The lamps would have fit in these rings around the bases, and what we can see here is that the clappers were removed. And so we have evidence now that these bells were silenced. And there is one more example in Spain of this, but the bell actually was in Oran in Algeria, so you can see how far east this practice was. So it was Spain, Morocco, and then Algeria. And this bell lamp basically was in Oran, Algeria, but in the 15th century, a cardinal named Cisneros, they were fighting another crusade in North Africa at that time. He brings the bell back to Spain and houses it there, and today it's in the Museo Arqueológico in Madrid. Originally, they understood these as sort of hanging upside down, and so this is actually a lamp from the Alhambra, and they attached this lamp to that, saying that, oh, this is probably what they would have looked like. This was obviously before 1970. They finally did get it right, and so actually, this is what the bell lamp would have looked like on its own. So you can see that it's in size to these, it's much different, but they all are following a similar pattern. This is the second style with the triangular open work brackets around it. And so this project, as it evolved, I understood it as the patrons of these lamps are directly evoking architectural buildings. I think with the microdomes that we see at the bottom of the lamp and the crenellations around the base plate, there is this purposeful imitation of architecture or microarchitecture in the ornamentation of these artifacts. That was not just common to lamps, but it's common to the metalwork during that entire time period around the Mediterranean and in Europe as well. And so this is a brazier from the same 13th century. It's in the Museo Arqueológico in Madrid. It's from Al-Andalus, it's from Spain. But you can tell again that here's a crescent, sort of crowning a building type structure. Here are the crenellations again. We have Arabic script going around. And so this brazier, again, we see a pattern of microarchitecture being used in metalwork. Why would we have this combination of microarchitectural metalwork being used with bells as lamps in a mosque? Number one, when I did this project and traced the history, I looked back at the poetry that's going on in this time period. And as a city, so at the first part of this talk was basically as Muslims conquered these cities in the Near East, we see a silencing of the Simantra or the bell in many circumstances. But as we go back to Spain and we see the Reconquista and the Northern Christian armies retaking, the word re is actually problematic, but taking southern Spain and converting mosques into churches, there was a real pain in the rulers' hearts when buildings were being changed. So, for instance, when Valencia was taken in 1238, Ibn al-Abbar, he was the vizier of the ruler of Valencia, he sent to Tunis to seek help, And in his plea for help, it's in verse poetry. And one of the verses says, "Woe for the mosques which have become churches for the enemy, and woe for the call to prayer which has been replaced by the bell." So we can actually see that the counter product of this domination of the public space is very similar to what we saw in the earlier period, where now the adhan, the Muslim call to prayer, is being silenced by the bell. And Muslims often were not allowed to publicly call the open call to prayer in conquered cities, but they could do it outside in many cases. And so, lastly, we look at these monuments or these artifacts as a testimony to this time period. And through the historical record as well, we understand that it was very important during this time period for Muslim rulers to actually try to take as many bells back as spolia as they could. So this is an area view of a township called Huete in Castilla-La Mancha in Spain. And basically, you can see that here is the city. And you can imagine this was a Christian settlement in the end of the 12th century, and these rulers, these Almohad rulers that I talk about, they basically attack the city, and they basically lose the battle against the Christians of Huete. But even though they lost the battle, they still take the bells back from the city. So it's recorded that they took 7 bells back, and they lost, but what the ruler says to do is that make sure that these bells are being put on the backs of mules so that everybody else sees them being marched from the city. And they took them across the city and most probably did not melt them down, but they took them back to Morocco across the Straits of Gibraltar as trophies of triumph. And so, as I conclude, and I know that we've gone all over time and space here. I always joke with people, I was actually on time today, but when I'm late, I said that a PhD basically knocked me out of the time and space continuum. I'm visiting all places and all times. But when we look at this artifact, and we see that light had its importance in medieval Islamic culture, and because light has its resemblance and its allegory in religious thought, the idea of lamps became very important objects of mosque patronage at the time. And so often rulers and people claiming to be the legitimate ruler would commission lamps for mosques to basically express their legitimacy. But in addition to that, I see the bells as basically a way for these rulers to say that because there's so much conflict going on, to basically use as a method to show that they are winning this conquest. So they bring them back purposefully across the Straits of Gibraltar. They do not melt them down. They hang them as mosque lamps, because lamps, in the imagery that's given to us in the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad is also likened to a lamp. And so the idea that the ruler was likened to a lamp was not very different than the rulers themselves. You can see the connection of rulers themselves using lamps as methods to convey the legitimacy of rule. And so the bells and the idea that the bells are silent adds an additional dimension to this idea of conquest. As I sum up, I said that meanings change over time. And I was on YouTube the other day, and I noticed that there was World Peace Day a few years back in Egypt. And in Egypt, what they did in World Peace Day is that they made sure that the Muslim call to prayer and bells were rung at the same time in the city. So I would like to leave everyone with that thought that symbols change. We're not in the Middle Ages anymore. And so hopefully all these beautiful symbols that were created as peaceful methods to call faithful people to congregate can all be heard in rhythm and harmony once again. Thanks.
What's the material that they predominantly use to make the modifications?
Copper alloy. So it's copper and obviously some brass mixed into it. Yeah, unfortunately, I always get asked this question, and people are like, well, you went on a Fulbright, were you able to sort of test the metal? And it's like, I wish it worked that way, but these objects are still in situ in an actual mosque that is visited daily. It's actually in the old city of Fez, so it was hard enough to basically get in there and start studying them and looking at them without offending people that are visiting the place for religious purposes. So, but what we do understand from is that they're a copper alloy of some sort.
By chance observe such a change in symbols in Cartagena?
I did not. No. Did you have any in mind, perhaps?
Oh, being there on the person in charge and declared
Building, right.
and there was
In the,
the Catholic Church.
right, and so this phenomenon, because there's so many areas in the Mediterranean that were once Muslim or once Christian and then converted back again, and so you will see this shared reciprocity of the sacred. So even the great Mosque of Cordoba today, it was changed into a cathedral in the 16th century, but the original 10th century prayer niche was never destroyed by following when the mosque was converted back to a church in 1236, all the Christian rulers after that still decided to keep this beautiful prayer niche in place. And so in places like Palermo, Sicily, as we dig further, just like we saw in the Almeria Mosque, if you look behind one layer, you'll actually see the earlier layer of the original building. So this idea that when a conquest takes place, there's this mass destruction of old buildings and everything needs to be re-symbolized. Actually, when we look back at the archaeology and architecture, that's mostly not always true. So I think people were smarter than that let's utilize the resources we have, and then symbols, as I said, change over time. But thank you. Yeah, I'm going to look into Cartagena to see what I can, because Spain is always turning up things all the time. Yes, please. Right, in what instance though? Like, what were they taking off the ships exactly? The lamps. I see what you're saying. Yes, it seems, so in the 15th century idea of Cardinal Cisneros that I talked about of Oran, Algeria, that's exactly what we see, is that he's taking it, but what is interesting, he does not change the lamp back into a bell again. Right, and that's very interesting, right. And so again, that lamp itself becomes a symbol of conquest. And so you sort of see this conquest of something that was already taken as conquest to be repurposed as another trophy and put prominently in these places. They valued it somehow. So this is convivencia, like I said at the beginning. I'm a product of the 80s, so there was a popular song in which they would say, shining, happy people holding hands, and that was by definition of convivencia. But convivencia, I believe, doesn't really always have to be happy, shining people holding hands, but it's basically them understanding what these symbols meant to the other and then reappropriating them. And often, art at that time period was actually art of harmony and beauty and peace, but these are ones that were born out of conflict. And Right, predominantly. I mean, if you look through the whole pre-modern period, the Ottoman, the Safavid, they're trophies, right? They're trophies of conquest.
Yeah, but they're objects.
Right.
So,
Exactly. Well, that is something I've struggled with, right? Is that we view conquest now as like, how can you turn something that's conquest into something with such a contentious way of spolia itself. But I think as we see spolia sort of in these buildings and we view it in its afterlife, it's what the viewer saw it afterwards, I guess, that gives it another life, if that makes any sense. So above it, basically, I think the top of the bell of how it was hung originally as well is still intact with the bell, and that's attached to that long. Where's the pointer? This long pipe at the top, and then you can sort of see these as resembling ostrich eggs, because often or not they would put ostrich eggs on those all the way from the older period, because rats would come down and eat the wax, I believe. So these were sort of this shape basically comes from the practice of putting, but then it's attached to a rope, and so I think the rope could higher it and lower it to come down, because I'm thinking 700, 800 pounds I definitely can't lift. No, I'm.
Chandeliers of the 18th century, huge ones.
Lowered, right. Exactly. Exactly. Yes. This is a very good question. So I will basically talk about my experience, because I can't talk about all the locals, but the person that sort of let me in the mosque during the time, he did not know there were bells in there, because they're kind of high up. So what you really notice is the bottom base plate when you're walking through it. The only reason I knew that I could recognize this as a bell was because I had studied them. But I do believe that a lot of passerbys would not see this as a piece of ornament in the 21st century. And so it's interesting to see that we do have chronicles of medieval travelers going to this mosque in the time period that I spoke about, and some of them are very conscious that there are bells there, and then they actually say that some of them were brought from Gibraltar, and they'll pinpoint from where they are brought from. Often this type of ornament is lost to the modern viewer from its original context. As I said, meanings are changing, so even that whole period of conquest is not really that important to a 21st century man visiting or woman visiting this spot. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. We live in a shared humanity, is how I look at it. Mm-hmm. Yes, please. I hope that wasn't the point, and thank you for asking that question. Bells, I think, in the symbol of conquest, like in a battle, those seem to be one of the coveted objects that they were taking. But the exchange of other art objects of value were always a part of this idea of conquest. So even with Christian Spain, we see all these objects that were made in these courts and palaces of medieval Islamic Spain being reused. So we have this whole collection of ivory pixies, basically, that are carved, beautiful, either walrus ivory or elephant ivory, tusk ivory, and with all these Islamic arabesque and human patterns and birds and inscriptions around it. And during these battles, a lot of these objects would be taken back, and today they're in reliquaries. They basically hold saints' relics inside them at times, and they're in churches, and so the object again gets a new purpose. And so another form of objects that I work on are textiles, Tiraz textiles, which were basically textiles that were made in royal factories. And so often or not, we have, because of the Crusades, they were taken back as commodity and then found themselves in local church reliquaries all throughout Europe, and some of them are believed to be the veil of St. Anne, but they all have basically Arabic inscriptions on it, and that opens us up into a new idea of how people re-understood these objects when they were taken back again. So I think people were okay with sharing at that time, I guess. Yes, please. Not at all. Definitely. So the way that we understand Islamic art is itself, and I'll go back to the map at the beginning, because this gives us a better idea. But Islamic art is basically the concept is problematic with the term Islamic in the first place, is because, as I said, by 656 they're already in North Africa, on the Egyptian part of North Africa, and by 711 in the early 8th century, they're stretching all the way to Spain, and they're also stretching all the way to China and India. So we have Hindu culture, we have ancient Chinese culture sort of mixing with medieval Muslims, we have Central Asian cultures, we have the Berber cultures of North Africa that were not Arabized. Today we consider North Africa as part of the Middle East, but at that time they were actually an indigenous, they like to be called the Amazigh, which means free people. Berber basically is a Greek term from Barbaros, so the language that was understood by the Romans, that they could not understand their language, so they basically would call them they were basically, yeah. That idea, basically, there was a whole indigenous population there. And as we look towards the northeast, there was this, so the major two empires that Islam first came into contact with was the Byzantine Empire to the northwest, and the Sasanian Persian Empire to the northeast. And so these two cultures that were established in this time period for millennia, Byzantine Roman culture and then Sasanian Persian culture, basically they actually provide a lot of the visual vocabulary for early Islamic art and architecture. So I always call Islamic art and architecture actually the child of Byzantine and Sasanian culture and visual culture. So yeah, they're counting, and so that religion and culture was Sasanian Persian, so there was Zoroastrian, and they also had Christians and Jews living in those cultures as well. So to just sort of focus on just Abrahamic faiths, I think is a little bit, it takes us away from the magnanimity of this whole body of what we call Islamic art and architecture, because there's just so many cultures in this vast geographic area that encompass, and what they are doing is that they're incorporating little bits of these in their own new culture that they've formed, and it's not only in terms of visual culture, but it's also in literary culture. So Greek texts that had already been translated into Middle Persian, which was Pahlavi, and Syriac, were actually translated into Arabic, and so part of medieval Arabic civilization or Islamic civilization is this revival of Greek philosophy, and so we have emergence of geography, literature, mathematics, and sciences, and all of this stuff going on at the same time. So yes, I mean it's basically they're inheriting a large part of the previous worlds in front of them. Right. Exactly, and that's what's most, because one thing we understand is that there's no figural imagery, but for those people in the 12th century, why did they not at least, remove the imagery while they were putting these pillars in the mosque? Right. And that's the sole purpose of why I call it from sound to light, is that the bell is not, as we saw in the early policies, it's not a preferred public sound, but then how do they assimilate it, or how do they make it their own, is by silencing it and putting it in one of their sacred forms to emphasize light. Yes, thank you. I think with archaeological evidence today, we know that the Temple Mount is the location of the temple, but I don't know if we've been able to assert that the Dome of the Rock itself is exactly where they would have built they didn't build it on the ruins of the temple, perhaps, right. That whole mount, from what we understand today, is where the temple was located. And that's why I always identify it as the Dome of the Rock and the temple, because to me as a historian, that's, right. Right. Hence we have history, and I have a job.